Consider the physical reality of a total solar eclipse. I mean, it is not merely a visual event, right? It is an immediate environmental shock.
It absolutely is.
The temperature plummets precipitously, avian life ceases its vocalizations, retreating to roosts under this false assumption of nightfall. The shadows cast upon the earth sharpen into bizarre crescent-shaped distortions.
Right. Every biological organism on the planet registers a profound disruption in the natural order.
Exactly. Yet human beings possess this peculiar arrogance. We treat the eclipse as an external spectacle, donning protective eyewear to observe the celestial mechanics, all while operating under the implicit assumption that our own internal cognitive architecture remains entirely isolated.
Well, it is a critical oversight, and it is entirely rooted in the dominant materialist paradigm. I mean, we observe the macroscopic environment reacting dynamically to the obscuration, yet we stubbornly model the human mind as a hermetically sealed vault.
We think we are unaffected by this massive withdrawal of foundational light.
Precisely. We map our synapses, we categorize our behavioral traits, and we construct this schematic of consciousness that we believe is absolute. But when you subject the human psyche to the rigorously precise architecture of Tantra-Jyotish, that closed-loop model simply shatters.
Because you realize you are not examining a static, isolated engine.
Right. You are looking at a highly permeable, consciousness-first framework that is inextricably tethered to cosmic mechanics.
So the objective of our deep dive is a complete reconstruction of that analytical framework. For you listening, we are explicitly bypassing the superficial pop culture astrology that dominates modern media.
The vague fortune-telling and the aesthetic omens.
Exactly. None of that. Instead, we are utilizing precise, traditional Jyotish terminology to map the exact internal machinery of the human psyche. Once that baseline architecture is established, we will apply it directly to understand the severe cognitive degradation that occurs during an eclipse.
Which is incredibly necessary.
It is, because whether your approach to reality is strictly rational and empirical or deeply engaged in esoteric philosophy, mastering these internal mechanics provides you with a highly pragmatic, actionable toolkit for navigating periods of intense cognitive distortion.
To initiate this reconstruction, we must aggressively correct our vocabulary. I mean, the analytical boundaries of any system are entirely defined by the precision of its terminology.
Right. If your foundational language is flawed, every subsequent conclusion will inherently fail.
Exactly. Therefore, to comprehend the architecture of Jyotish, we must systematically dismantle and abandon Western astrological jargon. The Western lexicon dilutes the precision of these concepts to the point of utter uselessness.
I want to emphasize exactly why that linguistic shift is mandatory for this deep dive. When we use words like planet or sign or house, we immediately force the listener's mind into a specific, restrictive paradigm.
You evoke images of physical astronomy spheres of rock and gas orbiting a star mixed with the triviality of newspaper horoscopes.
Which is intellectually void for our purposes. The operative terminology we are deploying here relies exclusively on the concepts of Graha, Rashi, Pava, and Yuti.
Let us examine the term Graha to illustrate this necessity. When Western systems discuss a planet, they are cataloging a physical object in a localized solar system.
Right.
In Tantra-Jyotish, a Graha is not defined by its physical mass or its orbital trajectory. A Graha is a fundamental active vector of human experience.
A vector. I think that is the crucial distinction.
It is. The etymology of the word implies a force that seizes, grasps, or takes hold of consciousness. It dictates a specific modality of how a human being processes reality. We are analyzing cognitive forces, not rocks in space.
And similarly, we must ground this analysis in the precise elemental framework of the Mahattattvas or Mahabhutas.
Yes, we are not dealing with the simplistic poetic concepts of earth, water, fire, air, and ether.
We are analyzing the highly specific energetic states of Prithivi, Jala, Agni, Vayu, and Akasha.
That distinction between a physical planet and a cognitive vector is the linchpin of this entire system.
So, if a Graha is a vector that seizes human experience, we can begin to accurately dissect the core components of human cognition. And the logical starting point for this dissection is the foundational luminary.
Surya.
Right, Surya. In Western psychological models, the sun is disastrously conflated with the ego or the outward personality or the social mask.
But under the rigorous framework of Jyotish, Surya operates on a completely different stratum. Surya is strictly defined as individual consciousness itself, the Atman.
It is the core, unadulterated experience of I exist, independent of any narrative you attach to that existence.
Exactly. It is the ultimate responsibility for one's own being. And it is crucial to define Surya by what it is absolutely not.
It is not your personality.
It is not your personality, it is not your behavioral quirks, your trauma, or your psychological complexes. Surya is the raw, silent, illuminating light of consciousness that allows you to realize you are a living entity. It establishes the fundamental law of your existence.
The way the Western concept of the ego misrepresents this raw awareness requires a very precise mechanical analogy to correct. So let us model the human cognitive apparatus as a complex computing system.
A very apt model.
In this model, Surya is not the user interface. Surya is the operating system's kernel. The kernel is the absolute base layer of existence for the machine. It manages the most fundamental operations of hardware and memory allocation.
It does not possess aesthetic preferences.
Right. It does not hold a personal history, and it does not interact with the end user. It simply dictates the undeniable fact that the system is powered on and running.
The personality, the ego, the complex psychological defense mechanisms, that is merely the software running on top of the kernel.
That architectural parallel is exact. I mean, the software can crash, the software can be uninstalled, heavily modified, or infected with viruses.
But the kernel remains the undeniable fact of the system's active conscious state. Surya is the kernel.
However, an operating system kernel existing in pure isolation does not process external environmental data. It simply sustains the state of existence.
Right. For that existence to interface with the external world, to actually perceive reality, the kernel requires highly specialized, localized subsystems.
Which moves us from the baseline of existence into the mechanics of perception. If Surya establishes the undeniable fact of I exist, what is the mechanism that actually registers the physical sensations and emotional resonances of that existence?
This introduces the first primary subsystem operating alongside Surya, which is Chandra. Chandra, which is frequently and inadequately translated merely as the moon, functions as the receptive mind, or manas.
So if Surya is the pure state of I exist, Chandra translates that into the visceral feeling of I am alive.
Exactly. It constitutes the psyche, the perceiving soul. It is the sensory apparatus responsible for pure perception and feeling. Chandra takes in the raw, unfiltered sensory and emotional data of life before that data is categorized, judged, or analyzed by any logical faculty.
So if I touch a hot stove, Chandra is the immediate, unthinking registration of heat and pain. It is the pure sensory intake.
Yes.
But Chandra alone doesn't formulate a plan to withdraw my hand, nor does it understand the thermodynamics of the stove. It just feels the burn.
Which necessitates a separate faculty to process the raw data Chandra is collecting. The pure perception of Chandra must be routed to an analytical processor.
Right.
Operating in a strictly analytical capacity is Buddha, frequently misunderstood as Mercury. Buddha is the intellect.
It governs logic.
Logic, which we define here strictly as the synthesis and analysis of objective data. Buddha is responsible for systematic classification, utility, and social formatting.
Returning to that hot stove example, then, if Chandra perceives the sudden intense heat, Buddha is the mechanism that rapidly classifies the temperature anomaly.
Exactly. It accesses stored data regarding physical tissue damage and formulates the logical necessity of instantly retracting the hand.
And beyond the immediate logical processing of Buddha, we have Guru. Guru represents rationality in a broader sense, encompassing reasoning and wisdom.
Right.
So if Buddha executes the immediate calculation to move the hand away from the stove, Guru is the faculty that comprehends the broader laws of thermodynamics, understands the concept of physical danger, and integrates that localized experience into a coherent worldview.
Guru explains the fundamental laws of existence that Surya establishes. But we must also account for the mechanisms of action and corporeality within this architecture.
We have Mangala.
Yes, Mangala, which is the acting self, or ahamkara. This is the vector of will, ambition, and self-identification. It is the explicit experience of I act, providing the driving force to execute the commands synthesized by Buddha and Guru.
Alongside it is Shukra, governing the physical vessel itself.
Shukra dictates corporeality, flesh, physical sensations, aesthetics, material comfort, and the overall physical embodiment of the human experience.
But as we map these active and receptive components, we arrive at a critical foundational node in the cognitive architecture that is almost universally misunderstood.
You're referring to Shani.
I am. The misinterpretation of Shani is arguably the most detrimental flaw in popular analytical models. I mean, in nearly all superficial interpretations, Shani is anthropomorphized into a karmic teacher, a strict punisher, or a malevolent enforcer of cosmic debt.
Which represents a severe deviation from its actual mechanical function.
Completely. We have already established that Surya dictates the baseline law of existence, and Guru explains that law. Therefore, Shani does not legislate, nor does it punish.
Shani is strictly defined as the capacity for pure observation, deliberation, and the ability to hold sustained attention.
The pervasive modern myth surrounding Shani as a punishing entity is a textbook example of human psychological projection.
It is. We possess a fundamental cognitive bias that compels us to anthropomorphize pure, objective observational forces.
Right. We project the image of a strict schoolmaster onto Shani because the human ego finds it profoundly uncomfortable to confront a force that simply observes without bias.
Without narrative and without offering comfort.
It is entirely a psychological defense mechanism. We assign narrative intent to an impersonal mechanism because dealing with a punisher allows us to adopt the role of a victim.
Exactly. If I am being punished by a celestial teacher,
Yeah.
I am the protagonist of a cosmic drama.
But if I am simply forced to observe the architecture of my own life with total unyielding focus, there is nowhere to hide. When a person is forced to slow down and sustain unflinching attention, which is the exact function of Shani, they inevitably perceive the resulting friction as punishment.
Because the modern mind is addicted to distraction and velocity. That is the core of the friction. Maintaining the pure definition of Shani as attention and observation is infinitely more productive for rigorous self-analysis.
It dismantles the victimhood inherent in the karmic punisher model.
Right. It posits a highly empowering structural reality. You are not being punished by the universe. You are simply being subjected to an internal mechanism that forces you to observe your operational baseline with total objective focus.
By stripping away these anthropomorphic overlays, we expose a highly granular, mechanical map of human cognition. I mean, we observe a strict division of labor.
Pure perception occurs in Chandra.
Logical data processing occurs in Buddha.
Rational wisdom is synthesized by Guru.
And sustained objective observation is maintained by Shani. This architecture allows us to isolate precisely which cognitive faculty is operating, or more importantly, which faculty is failing at any given moment.
This maps the internal machinery perfectly in a static state.
Yeah.
We possess the kernel, the sensory receivers, the logic processors, and the observation mechanisms.
However, human consciousness is never static. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is constantly subjected to the pressures of time.
Exactly. To understand how this architecture is disrupted during an eclipse, we must first examine the temporal vectors that pull this machinery forward and backward. This requires an analysis of Rahu and Ketu.
And the analysis of Rahu and Ketu requires another radical departure from astrological cliché. We must define them strictly as directional vectors through time and space.
They are not merely an arbitrary axis.
They are definitively not karmic nodes dictating a spiritual syllabus, and we must entirely discard the archaic metaphorical terminology of a dragon's head and tail, which reduces a profound cognitive concept to a fairy tale.
Approaching this mathematically, a vector possesses both magnitude and direction. Rahu is the directional vector pointing toward the future. It represents forward momentum, aspirations, and passions.
But we must analyze the structural reality of the future. The future, by definition, does not yet exist. It is entirely conceptual.
Therefore, Rahu is inherently intertwined with illusions, delusions, and an insatiable hunger. It is an undeniable, consuming need for that which has not yet materialized into reality.
That is a deeply unsettling proposition for the modern mindset. I mean, defining the drive toward the future as a force fundamentally fueled by illusion challenges our cultural obsession with constant progress.
It does. It dictates that forward momentum is always, to some degree, a pursuit of a mirage.
If Rahu is the vector pulling us into the theoretical future, Ketu is the tail of the vector, pointing backward into the materialized past.
Right. Ketu encompasses past experiences, ancestral traditions, and accumulated baggage. This baggage includes both deeply ingrained, hard-won lessons and residual calcified fears.
Crucially, because the past is already consumed, processed, and materialized, Ketu governs mysticism, detachment, and immaterialism.
It is what is left behind, the legacy and the abstraction of experience. It represents a withdrawal from the physical hunger of Rahu.
This formulates a critical cytological question regarding equilibrium. We have an inherent friction here.
Yes, immense friction.
If Rahu is the relentless drive forward, but its fuel source is fundamentally rooted in illusion and delusion, and K2 is grounded in the materialized reality of the past, but exerts a gravitational pull toward total detachment and apathy, how does a human consciousness maintain operational equilibrium?
How do we exist without falling entirely into the manic future delusion of Rahu or the paralyzing past apathy of Ketu?
Exactly.
Equilibrium within this architecture is maintained solely by the optimal, unobstructed functioning of the primary luminaries, Surya and Chandra, heavily supported by the rational stabilization of Guru and the observational anchor of Shani.
So when the kernel of consciousness Surya is operating with full illuminating power, it can direct the aspirational hunger of Rahu without becoming consumed by its inherent delusion.
Right, and it can utilize the processed data and experience of Ketu without succumbing to complete nihilistic detachment. The entire system requires the constant, clear light of consciousness to manage the immense friction generated by these temporal vectors.
Which brings us to the precise focal point of our deep dive. We have fully mapped the cognitive architecture.
We understand the OS kernel of consciousness, the subsystems of sensory perception and logic, and the temporal vectors of hunger and detachment.
We possess the blueprint. We can now examine exactly what happens when cosmic mechanics physically disrupt and degrade this internal machinery.
We must radically reframe our understanding of what an eclipse actually is. According to the rigorous framework of Tantra-Jyotish, eclipses are not merely external visual phenomena where celestial bodies align in the sky.
They represent a profound systemic disruption of the inner cognitive state caused by the literal obscuration of the primary luminaries.
Let us detail the specific mechanics of this disruption. A lunar eclipse directly obscures Chandra. Based on our established vocabulary, this means human perception, feelings, and the receptive mind are physically and energetically confused.
The sensory intake apparatus, the mechanism that registers I am alive and collects emotional data, is compromised. It is receiving corrupted signals.
A solar eclipse is structurally more severe as it obscures Surya. This clouds pure individual consciousness. The fundamental awareness of existence, the Atman, is temporarily veiled.
To return to the computing analogy, the kernel of the operating system is starved of its primary power source.
Exactly. Analyzing the mechanics of light in this context is paramount. We are not merely discussing photons traveling through space and striking the retina. We are discussing the penetrating, organizing force of consciousness itself.
Surya generates direct, illuminating light. Chandra operates on reflected light, processing the illumination of the kernel.
During an eclipse, both the direct and reflected light of consciousness fail to penetrate human awareness with sufficient efficiency. When human cognition is starved of this foundational light, the resulting vacuum does not remain empty.
It is immediately filled by the destabilizing forces we previously mapped. Illusions strengthen. Deeply unconscious, highly reactive tendencies surface instantly.
Why? Because the objective observational light of Shani and the rational synthesizing light of Guru are entirely dependent on the power source of Surya. When Surya is obscured, the faculties of observation and rationality are deprived of power.
The resulting state is one of acute, systemic, internal conflict. A highly specific and dangerous conflict frequently arises during this period of obscuration between the receptive mind, Chandra, and the intellect, Buddha.
This is where the cognitive cascade failure begins. This specific conflict is inevitable because Buddha, the logical processor, is designed to maintain systemic order. Its function is to constantly analyze, synthesize, and classify incoming data.
However, during an eclipse, the data it is receiving from Chandra is fundamentally corrupted.
Exactly. The intellect attempts to logically process sensory and emotional input that is irrational, distorted, and starved of illuminating consciousness. This leads to a complete breakdown in the system's capacity for adequate evaluation.
It is the exact equivalent of a systemic power failure in a highly complex facility, like a nuclear reactor or a data center.
That is a perfect structural parallel.
When the primary power grid Surya and Chandra drops offline, the facility automatically switches to backup generators. Buddha, the intellect, acts as that backup generator, frantically attempting to compensate and keep the facility's operations running.
But the environmental sensors, Chandra, are feeding the backup system erratic, contradictory data.
Right. The backup system begins to overheat as it tries to apply logic to chaos. It conflicts with the corrupted sensory input, leading to a cascading systemic failure where the logic itself becomes destructive.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the internal reality during an eclipse. The capacity for adequate rational evaluation is verifiably compromised. Recognizing this inevitable cognitive degradation is the absolute foundation of the Tantra-Jyotish behavioral protocols.
And these protocols are not superstitious rituals born of fear. They are precise, calculated risk mitigation strategies designed to protect an individual when their cognitive architecture is actively malfunctioning.
Let us analyze these risk mitigation protocols rigorously, beginning with the strict prohibitions, the do-nots.
The foundational logic is this. Because consciousness and perception are clouded, making external moves based on internal logic is extremely dangerous. You are operating on corrupted data.
Therefore, the primary directive is the total suspension of major external action. Do not make important decisions. Do not initiate new projects. Do not sign contracts.
The specialized branch known as Tantra-Jyotish classifies this window as a highly unfavorable time for any significant undertakings.
The rationale is unyielding. You cannot trust your own evaluation matrix. Your Buddha is overheating on false data from Chandra.
Furthermore, one must not engage in arguments, not even internal hypothetical ones. There is a strict prohibition against rushing into criticisms or formulating rigid judgments.
The Count to 10 protocol becomes a mandatory cognitive firewall. It is no longer polite advice. It is a structural necessity.
Before formulating a thought, before speaking, a delay must be manually inserted into the cognitive process to prevent the malfunctioning intellect from executing corrupted logic.
Similarly, there is a strict injunction against pursuing business, financial goals, or personal ambitions via dark methods or at any cost during this period.
Because the system's foundational light is obscured, it is highly vulnerable to base entropic forces.
Engaging in unethical or ruthlessly self-serving action during an eclipse results in a permanent loss of systemic purity and internal satisfaction. It embeds corruption deeply into the psyche while the system's defenses are down.
We must also address the critical physical safety rules. The injunction to never look directly at an eclipse is universal. This is a rare instance where ancient Jyotish texts and modern astrophysical guidelines perfectly align on the physical danger to the visual apparatus.
However, there is a strict physiological protocol that modern rationalists often instinctively reject: the mandate to not consume food during the roughly 6-hour eclipse window.
The modern rejection of the fasting protocol stems from a failure to understand the energetic thermodynamics mapped by Jyotish. The prohibition on eating is tied to the concept of Agni.
Agni is the internal digestive fire, the metabolic process. In this framework, the localized Agni within the human body is directly linked to and dependent upon the macrocosmic Surya.
When Surya is obscured by the eclipse, the body's capacity to metabolize and process physical matter is severely degraded.
Eating during the 6-hour window forces the gastrointestinal system to process dense physical matter without adequate internal fire, creating physiological toxicity and systemic sluggishness.
It is essentially a rapid micro-disruption of the body's chronobiology. The system registers the obscuration and dials down metabolic operations, assuming a state of rest. Forcing intake during that localized shutdown creates friction.
There is also a protocol regarding the external environment. Do not leave food uncovered overnight.
The logic dictates that base entropic forces, energetic corruption, are highly active when the primary luminaries are blocked.
If food must be left out, for instance as ancestral offerings, it requires the protective barrier of lit candles or burning incense to counteract this active corruption and maintain the purity of the space.
When we synthesize these prohibitions, we are observing a framework that demands temporary, deliberate behavioral pausing. It is a calculated, strategic retreat.
By acknowledging that your internal evaluation mechanisms are temporarily defective, refusing to make decisions is not an act of fear. It is a highly rational, protective act of self-preservation.
But implementing this requires a rigorous, often uncomfortable intersection of ancient protocol and modern reality. Consider the psychological discipline required to enforce a strict no argument and no decision rule in today's hyper-reactive environment.
We operate in corporate and digital ecosystems where immediate responses are violently demanded via email, text, and constant communication channels.
To consciously enforce cognitive paralysis, to look at an urgent message from an executive and conclude, my decision-making matrix is currently compromised, I will not execute a response, is an act of profound structural rebellion against modern pacing.
It is entirely countercultural. Modern society demands constant, unbroken output, regardless of internal systemic integrity. It treats the human mind as an industrial machine that must run 24/7.
Tantra-Jyotish demands the exact opposite: the preservation of internal systemic integrity above all external demands for output.
While external action is suspended, however, the system does not go dormant. internal action becomes highly productive. The protocol shifts from what must be avoided to what must be executed.
This introduces the constructive practices, the do's, and the evergreen temporal mechanics of these periods. The obscured environment, ironically, provides optimal conditions for specific, transformative internal actions.
From a cognitive standpoint, the primary constructive action is the ruthless elimination of excess. It is the time to jettison ineffective habits, superficial rituals, and obsolete approaches to reality.
However, one must explicitly retain proven values, ancestral traditions, and essential foundational principles. The mandate is to focus purely on essence over form.
Do not cling to the outward aesthetic shape of your life. Analyze and grasp the core meaning.
There is a deep psychological paradox here regarding transformation in darkness. The protocol advises us to actively identify and analyze our illusions during the eclipse. But why does the withdrawal of standard consciousness, the obscuration of Surya, allow for the identification of deep-seated illusions? Logic would suggest we need more light to see our flaws, not less.
Because the standard daily light of consciousness often acts as a highly focused spotlight. This spotlight illuminates exactly what the ego wants to see, actively casting deep shadows that hide our baseline unconscious habits.
When the main spotlight is turned off by the obscuration, the glaring surface-level distractions disappear.
Exactly. The systemic reboot highlights the background errors. The lack of standard light paradoxically allows the individual to observe the subtle, unconscious processes and behavioral loops that normally operate completely undetected beneath the intense glare of daily routine life.
If, during this period of deliberate obscuration and observation, a true conscious insight arises, if an authentic awakening to a necessary structural transformation occurs, the protocol demands that you act on it.
However, because we have established that your internal logic processor, Buddha, is currently suspect and prone to corruption, you must not act on this insight unilaterally.
Right. You must seek counsel. You do not rely on your own compromised intellect. You seek out an authoritative mentor, a guru, to externally validate the insight before executing a life change.
On a purely physical level, extreme caution is mandated throughout this period. Activities requiring precise coordination, driving, traveling, operating machinery, and even performing automatic, routine household tasks must be approached with significantly heightened vigilance.
Because the obscuration degrades the systemic capacity for attention, the function of Shani is degraded, the risk of injury through simple carelessness or lack of focus is massively magnified.
There is also a structural requirement to cleanse both the physical self and the immediate operating space.
Ablutions, known as pusha snana, are recommended, along with the burning of specific purifying agents like sandalwood or frankincense, to recalibrate the immediate energetic environment and counteract the ambient corruption. Spiritually and cognitively, it is a period demanding intense, sustained internal practice. Silence, deep meditation, the rigorous recitation of mantras, and the performance of Shanti ceremonies rituals explicitly directed toward supreme powers to ward off systemic troubles are crucial.
This internal focus must reach its absolute peak intensity during the maximum phase of the eclipse.
We need to define the exact mechanics of this timing because it dictates how these protocols are applied. The dangerous, acute window of the eclipse spans exactly 6 hours and 48 minutes.
This highly specific time frame dictates the 6-hour fasting rule in the period of maximum internal practice. But the overarching vulnerability interval is conceptualized much more broadly.
Yes, it spans 7 days conceptually, 3 days prior to the eclipse, a day of the eclipse itself, and 3 days following.
This 7-day conceptual window requires strict, unwavering adherence to caution. It recognizes a fundamental truth of cosmic mechanics. These forces do not operate on a digital, binary on-off switch. They exert a gradient of influence. The energetic disruption builds in intensity over 3 days, reaches a critical mass during the obscuration, and then slowly dissipates over the following 3 days.
Interrogating this 7-day window reveals a fascinating psychological mechanism. Viewing time as a gradient of influence rather than a binary state of danger versus safety forces a person into a sustained state of mindfulness.
It demands an extended conscious engagement of Shani, that faculty of unflinching observation.
Modern society rarely, if ever, cultivates the capacity to maintain high-alert observation for a full week. You cannot simply hold your breath for 6 hours. You must fundamentally alter your mode of engagement with reality, carefully evaluating every thought and impulse for 7 consecutive days.
It is a mandatory period of sustained systemic auditing. It forces you to operate deliberately rather than automatically. However, while these overarching rules and gradients apply universally to human consciousness in general, the geometry of a specific eclipse targets certain psychological profiles in individuals far more acutely than others.
The disruption is not distributed equally across the population.
Correct. This introduces the highly specific concept of individual vulnerability matrices. To understand the intensity and specific nature of the obscuration for a single individual, we require an exact birth chart, the Janma-Kundali, calculated with precise time, date, and location data.
Extreme vulnerability is triggered only under highly specific intersecting geometric conditions.
The first critical vector of severe vulnerability occurs if an individual's Janma-Rashi, the exact Rashi where Chandra was located at the moment of their birth or their Janma Nakshatra, the specific lunar mansion, is identical to the Rashi or Nakshatra where the current eclipse is taking place in the sky.
Let's unpack the structural logic of that collision. If the eclipse occurs exactly in your Janma-Rashi, it is a direct, localized hit on the precise cognitive framework you use to perceive reality.
The core operating system of your receptive mind, your sensory intake, is the epicenter of the obscuration. Your fundamental ability to process sensory and emotional data is directly compromised.
You will feel as though your ability to interpret reality has vanished. Meanwhile, someone with a completely different Janma-Rashi might only experience the eclipse as a minor background disturbance, a slight sluggishness or irritability.
Precisely. The impact is highly localized based on the initial programming of the cognitive architecture.
The second condition of extreme vulnerability is if the Lagna Rashi, the ascendant, the specific Rashi that was rising on the eastern horizon at the exact moment of birth, matches the eclipse Rashi.
The Lagna dictates the physical vessel and the core trajectory of the individual. An eclipse here results in a direct, highly personal impact on the individual's outward manifestation in the world and their physical vitality.
The complexity deepens exponentially when we analyze where the eclipse falls within the bhavas, the specific houses of the individual's birth chart.
The bhava dictates the specific arena of life where the disruption will manifest. If the eclipse occurs in the first bhava, it strikes at the core individuality and essence of the person.
If it hits the fifth bhava, the systemic disruption targets creativity, intellectual output, and matters concerning children.
The seventh bhava governs relationships, partnerships, and cooperation. The ninth bhava dictates social value, higher knowledge, and personal mission. Activation of these specific bhavas yield highly concrete, localized disruptions.
Additionally, to fully map the vulnerability, we must examine the condition of the Rashi body, the planetary ruler of the Rashi where the eclipse occurs.
If the Rashi body is currently afflicted, defeated, or positioned poorly in the individual's birth chart, it strips away their natural systemic defenses. It leaves them entirely vulnerable to the obscuration, unable to mount a cognitive defense against the disruption.
This immense complexity, the highly specific intersection of Janma-Rashi, Lagna, the exact bhavas, and the condition of the Rashipati clarifies exactly why generalized mass media horoscopes are logically void within the rigorous framework of Jyotish.
You absolutely cannot distill a highly specific mechanical intersection, requiring exact spatial and temporal coordinates, into a generic paragraph meant to apply to a twelfth of the human population.
It is mathematically and conceptually absurd, but I want to explore the phenomenological difference in these specific activations. Based on this structural logic, how does the activation of the first bhava, which governs the core essence, differ qualitatively in the subject's experience from the activation of the seventh bhava, governing cooperation during a total obscuration?
It is the stark difference between an internal core collapse and an external interface collision. If the eclipse activates the first bhava, the obscuration attacks the individual's fundamental sense of self.
So the subjective experience is one of profound self-doubt, a sudden loss of physical vitality, and a terrifying inability to comprehend their own identity or purpose.
Exactly. To return to the computational model, the kernel itself feels as though it is failing. The operating system cannot locate its own root directory.
A total, paralyzing internal disorientation. The machine cannot remember why it was turned on.
Yes. Conversely, if the obscuration hits the seventh bhava, the individual's core sense of self, their first bhava, may remain entirely intact. They may feel internally confident and energized.
However, their ability to perceive and interface with the other is severely compromised.
The disruption manifests as sudden, inexplicable conflicts in partnerships, an inability to understand the motivations of a spouse or a business partner, and a complete breakdown of diplomatic logic.
The individual feels internally sound, but they perceive the external world of relationships as suddenly hostile, chaotic, or incomprehensible.
The system fails entirely at the interface port, rather than the central processor.
The machine is running perfectly, but it cannot connect to the network without generating catastrophic errors.
Correct. The vulnerability matrix dictates precisely where the systemic failure will manifest, allowing for targeted mitigation rather than generalized anxiety.
As we synthesize the layers of this exhaustive analysis, we have fundamentally established that Tantra-Jyotish is not a predictive parlor trick.
It is not fortune-telling. It is an exact, complex, and highly technical schematic of human consciousness.
We have mapped the internal luminaries that provide power, the rational and observational faculties that process data, and the directional vectors of time that generate friction.
Furthermore, we have demonstrated that when cosmic mechanics, such as an eclipse, physically disrupt this architecture, adhering to precise behavioral, cognitive, and physical protocols is not an act of ancient superstition.
It is a necessary, highly rational methodology to mitigate risk, protect the cognitive apparatus from corrupted data, and leverage the temporary cognitive disruption for profound internal auditing.
The directive for you listening is clear. Integrate these timeless rules into your permanent cognitive toolkit.
The understanding of the 7-day awareness window surrounding an obscuration, the strict avoidance of crucial decisions during periods of cognitive degradation, and the practice of maintaining equilibrium between the hunger of the future and the detachment of the past are highly pragmatic strategies for maintaining sanity in a reactive world.
They serve as the definitive operational manual for the human machine.
Which leaves us with a rigorous philosophical question for you to independently dissect. We have spent this time mapping how deeply and predictably a temporary cosmic shadow can destabilize human perception, logic, and willpower. If a brief, mathematically predictable obscuration of light can so thoroughly compromise our internal cognitive architecture, what does our intense, often defensive psychological reaction to this brief darkness reveal about our dangerous, unexamined over-reliance on external continuity to maintain the illusion of our own internal control?